Namo tassa bhagavato arahato sama sambuddhassa. So dear respected Thai, dear friends joining us online. This is a very quiet week in the monastery. We don't have any guests. And it's been a cool autumn in Deer Park. And we're studying the 40 tenets on the 17th tenet. Which is the third noble truth. Can be called the truth of happiness. Happiness. So this is a good news because the first noble truth is suffering. And when we look deeply into suffering, we know that we can find happiness. And usually when we study the Four Noble Truths, we learn that the first one is suffering or ill-being, and the second is the cause of suffering, and then the cessation of suffering is the third noble truth, and then finally the path. So to call the third noble truth happiness is a bit of a revolution. Thai saw that if we call the third noble truth cessation, people can misunderstand and they think everything just stops. Like we can think wrongly that the 5 skandhas stop. For example, our feelings stop, our body stops. And then we feel very afraid because what more is there if everything stops? And that's because we get caught in ideas of birth and death. So we've already been talking about how we construct an idea of our life, which starts with birth and ends with death. And so before this, there's nothing. There's only non-being. And then after death, there's also non-being. And then during this time, there's being. And so most of us live our lives thinking, I just want to be as long as possible. Extend it, and we fear the time we go into non-being. And the Buddha had the insight that that's because we misunderstand the nature of, we misattribute to nature ideas of being and non-being, when actually there's no evidence for them at all. They are just concepts, they're mental constructs. And the universe is full of wonders, is full of phenomena which are operating, and they have been operating since beginningless time, and they continue to operate until endless time. And that is our experience of living. So this is not based in a theory, but it's based in our lived experience. Because of the nature of memory, we don't often remember what happened beforehand, but we know that in every cell of our body there are chemicals that have been used. There's water, there's carbon, metals like iron in small quantities, and these elements have been passed through the universe for billions of years, and we are just the latest manifestation of these chemicals. We know as well that the language that we speak is a continuation. It's what we learn from our parents, our teachers, and so forth. The air that we breathe is constantly being recycled by the trees. The water that we drink comes from the clouds, the ocean, and then when we urinate or sweat, then it goes back into the rivers and the earth and the clouds. And that is a constant nature that we can observe in the present moment. It's nothing theoretical. It just takes stopping and mindfulness to see it. And so when we look at things like that, we don't get caught in ideas of being and non-being, because we see that whatever we call it is what we say something that is only made of non-it elements. And the same is true for non-being. When we say something isn't, it creates the thing that it is not. Right? We can't try thinking of a non-tree without thinking of a tree. It's not possible, right? We can only think of a non-tree by excluding all things which are trees. So that's a principle of exclusion. And so non-being only makes sense in terms of being, and being only makes sense in terms of the elements that make up that thing. And that is why we prefer the term emptiness rather than being. So this whole process of being and non-being when we look deeply, we see that it is ultimately empty of any kind of notion of being or non-being. It is just things as they are. And they are directly experienced. So in our body, we can be aware of our flesh, our bones, the air coming in and out of our body. We can be aware of the water in our body. We can also be aware of the cells, continuation of our parents, our father, our mother, many generations. So looking deeply like that, that is a direct experience of things as they are. And if you look in your every cell of your body, for example, you can see that your father and mother are there. Even if you may have your father or mother may have passed away, and you say, well, how can my father be there? Because he's gone into non-being, but he's still there in every cell of your body. So he continues. And that is a deep looking that we can experience directly. So this whole notion of being and non-being, we call the realization of emptiness. And that is not a cause for sadness. Usually when we say in common language, all things, it's empty, we want it to be full. But emptiness here is a cause for celebration, because it means that there's nothing that is inherently cut off from anything else. There's no existence which is separate from all phenomena in the universe. Everything that we experience, it's all connected. And it's only empty of one thing, which is the idea of being, a separate self, a separate existence. So when the Buddha taught about the Third Noble Truth, he said it is a cessation of suffering. And in the same way that we talk about being and non-being, we know that the cessation of suffering is happiness. We can't think of suffering without thinking of happiness. Yeah? Suffering is the lack of happiness. Happiness is the lack of suffering. And so they are, although we talk about them as two different things, they can only make sense together, just like being and non-being. So when we think of suffering, we think of all those things that exclude happiness. And when we think of happiness, we think of all those things that exclude suffering. So it is like the light and dark. So when we have the light, that is the absence of darkness. And when we have darkness, we cannot think of it in another way except the absence of light. And so in some real sense, light and dark are, just like being and non-being, suffering and happiness. And the wisdom of Buddhist teaching is to recognize that most of our thinking is based on these kind of dualistic ways of looking at the world. Yeah. Light, dark, being, non-being, coming, going, same, different. Our language is made up of concepts which only make sense with the opposite. And you cannot take, so in the case of happiness, we cannot conceive of happiness without suffering. It doesn't make sense. If there's no suffering, then what would be the point of calling something happiness? So Tai often said, I don't want my students to live in a place where there's no suffering. Because I know in a place where there's no suffering, there's not the possibility of happiness. So we can say, viva la souffrance. We don't want to create more suffering in the world, but we recognize that there is suffering, and because we are aware of that, thanks to the teaching of the First Noble Truth, happiness is possible. So that is a meditation, and that's something that I practice myself. Whenever I experience some kind of pain, whether it's a physical pain in my body, maybe indigestion, or some mental pain, some memory, some regret, something that I said or did that I feel was not so skillful or maybe hurtful. So I practice to look into that thing and see that in that suffering, there is happiness. So rather than trying to push it away, put on headphones and listen to some music, or go to the kitchen to get some food, or do something, pick up a book and just forget about that suffering. I practice to go and really go into it and look at it deeply, really see what's going on there. And by doing that, I take care of it. So it's not a kind of like analytical, like picking apart our suffering or our trauma, but it's caring for. So there's like two hands. So mindfulness are like two hands that are holding that suffering. So it's a non-violent practice of taking care of our suffering. Tai often said, if we know how to take care of our suffering, we suffer much less. And that is what mindfulness is for. Mindfulness, as well as concentration and insight. Those three trainings that we already talked about, they are there to help us to transform and take care of our suffering. And so the more mindfulness is there, the more we're able to take care. Again, the image of a child that's crying, a baby, the mother holding the baby to her chest, And she may not know what is the cause of the suffering of that child, but she holds it. And by holding it to her body, she becomes aware of, as well, the feelings of her child. And that holding, that embrace, actually transforms the situation. So that is the spirit with which we approach our suffering. We hold it like a child. And it really works. That's the beauty of it. It's not just some intellectual idea. We suffer, so you hold your suffering. And I know one of my older brothers, sometimes he would practice just hugging himself. If there was some difficulty that was coming up, or something that some kind of suffering for him, he would just put his hands around himself and just hold. Maybe we can try. Because we know that these hands, these arms, are the hands of our father and our mother. And we may be separated from them, emotionally, physically. But because in every cell of our body there is our mother and our father, we can take this moment to just allow them to hug us, to hold us, just as we were when we were a child. All of that unqualified, unconditional acceptance is there. Okay. Thank you for practicing. It's a very lovely practice of accepting ourselves, of having compassion for ourselves. We are human. And we are lovely, and sometimes we're also ugly and not so friendly, and sometimes we are kind, and sometimes we are mean. But that is our nature as human beings, and we try to learn and grow. And actually the Four Noble Truths are, for me, the essence of learning and growing. They are a process which is constantly going on. So just to review, so the first truth is the truth of dukkha, suffering. And the second is samudaya, or dukkha samudaya. But for short, we say samudaya in Sanskrit. And then the third is nirodha. Stopping. So, dukkha samudaya, dukkha nirodha, the cessation or stopping of suffering, dukkha nirodha. And for short, we say marga, the path. Mriga is a Sanskrit for an animal or a deer. And we know that in the forest, we often, if we are trying to find our way, we follow the paths of the deer or the animals that they make through the forest. So marga is from the word for animal or deer. And the longer form is dukkha nirodha gamini patipada. But I won't write that. It means the pathway going to the cessation of suffering. Dukkha nirodha, the cessation of suffering. Gamini patipada. Gamini, going. Patipada, walk to the path, the way. But for short, because that was so long, so in the later commentaries we just say marga, path. So it's very short. If you are interested in classical Buddhist teachings. And so what Thapa poses is that so that we are not confused by this teaching on cessation, because we say cessation, cessation, and then people can, in the past, practitioners have gotten caught in a kind of nihilistic way of looking at themselves. Like if I could just get rid of my feelings, my perceptions, my emotions, my consciousness, and then finally my body, then that will be peace. And that is a very wrong understanding. And so that's totally missing and misunderstanding the Buddha's teaching. As we learn, the 5 skandhas are not something that we need to get rid of. It is the tendency to cling, to grasp onto the skandhas, which leads to suffering. That's why they call them upadana khandha. This is a review for those of you who watched already, but we talked about upadana. Upadana skandha. Upadana, upadana. Upadi, it means appropriating. And the skandhas are the aggregates, or there's one early meaning of skandha, which is like can be like a chunk of a tree that's branching out. So we have our body, our feelings, perceptions, mental formations, consciousness. So 5 aspects. And that's not to say that our experience of the world are completely subsumed within those 5 things, but that at a moment-to-moment experience of life, we're grasping at our body, our feelings, our perceptions, our mental formations, our consciousness. And so, as we've been learning, the Buddhist teaching is for our freedom. And so we focus on those things that are impeding, obstructing our freedom. And our attachment to our body, the way we look, to our feelings, the way we feel, perceptions and so forth, that is actually the source of a lot of our suffering. And so when we talk about nirodha, it means the cessation of grasping at our body, our feelings, perceptions, and so forth. And so the path is the path that is leading to the cessation of grasping. And so when we talk about samudaya, the arising or the cause of suffering, oftentimes in the ancient texts, we talk about 3 kinds of cause. This is the traditional teaching. 3 kinds of causes for suffering, and it's kind of repeated like a kind of dogma over and over again. So there's the craving for sense pleasures, or grasping at the 5 skandhas, craving for being, and craving for non-being. So this samudaya is based on trishna, 3 kinds of craving. this word Trishna means craving or strong desire, grasping, kind of like a thirst. So in Buddhist cosmology, we have a realm of the hungry ghosts, which are beings that are constantly thirsty. They're thirsting for food, for water. They're hungry, but their neck is very, very narrow, and their stomach is very big. So even though they try to drink, to eat, but they can only get a little bit through, and so they're constantly hungry. And that is an image to help us see when we are actually experiencing that ourselves. We're living as a hungry ghost. We seek power or fame or wealth or just recognition in our job, a title. And because we keep thirsting for that recognition, that like one-upmanship, we suffer. So that is, we can call craving for being, right? We want to get a bonus, we want to get a better job, we want to have a better house, we want to have a better car, because we project an image of ourselves as somebody who has that title, who has that job, who has that career, who has that car, and we want that image. We see that car, that Tesla, that, what are they called, Mig Cooper or whatever? Anyway, whatever car you imagine yourself sitting in, and you just think, and so you go down to the car salesman and you're looking around and you already see yourself sitting in that car. And the salesman, of course, knows that you want to be sitting in that car, and so he gets you sitting in it, and you go for a drive, and you feel the power of the car. And now you have become the person who owns that car. You are no longer that person who just walked onto the car lot. You are now the owner of a new Tesla or whatever, Porsche, whatever. So that is craving for being. And that is a huge source of suffering. And just like we learned, there can be no idea of being without an idea of non-being. And so there's also craving for non-being. For example, I do not want to be a cruel person. I do not want to be somebody who's living on destitute on the street, addicted to heroin. Those are things I don't want to be, right? So there's a kind of craving for not being something. When somebody tells you, for example, we have the practice in our community of beginning anew, and when there's a conflict, we'll sit down and practice to say kind things about the other person, and then express regret about anything we might have done that's unskillful. And then we have a chance, if it's necessary, to express our hurt because of what we perceive someone else has done or said or thought. And sometimes I've experienced where when somebody shares, if I practice beginning anew, I see that, wow, their perception is so different from how I perceive myself. This is part of the benefit of doing beginning anew, because you see that, wow, people have other perceptions than you have towards yourself. And sometimes feelings come up like, I don't want to be the person they're describing to me. I want to be something else, right? So there's a kind of craving for non-being, like, I want nothing to do with that person. I have nothing to do with that person you're describing, that unkind person who said those things. And that's not what I perceive for myself. And usually the truth is somewhere neither in being nor non-being. There's a middle way. And that's why the practice of beginning anew is so helpful, because you have an image you project of yourself, and you may be attached to that image. And other people have an image that they project onto you, and they also may be attached to that image. But by letting go of both your own attachment and helping them also, they practice to let go, then we arrive somehow at a deeper understanding of the situation. So the craving for being and non-being is an obstacle to our understanding. You can listen to the sound of the bell. And we have, in the present moment, we have also craving for sense pleasures. Yeah. So, chocolate, alcohol, drugs. Yeah. So, it's not easy to put it into the category of being or non-being, but it's just fulfilling sense pleasures, pleasurable feelings that come about from the contact we make through our eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So that is also one of the three traditional sources of things that objects of our craving. So this is the traditional presentation, and Tai says it's not enough just to say that craving is the source of all suffering. And so Tai looked at the marga, the path, and said, there's suffering or ill-being, but there's also happiness, right? The cessation of ill-being. And just like there is a path of happiness, a path of well-being, there's also an ignoble path. So we have the noble path, marga, Arya marga, and we also have an ignoble path. So then, as we know, the Eightfold Noble Path is a kind of training. So there are different areas of our life where we focus on cultivating positive qualities, because we know that with good habits, we have a foundation for happiness. And so touching happiness means touching the unconditioned. But when we are overwhelmed by our wrong action, wrong view, wrong livelihood, it's very difficult for us to touch the unconditioned, because we are beset, we are completely caught up in our suffering. Yeah. It's like the man who sleeps with someone else's wife. He's constantly in fear that the husband will find out and come and try to harm him. Right? So it's a kind of gross example, but when we steal something, when we take things that don't belong to us, if we harm others physically, mentally, then when we are quiet and we look deep inside, we see that there's some kind of fear that comes up. when we hurt somebody, we may think, I am the winner. I declare victory. But that victory also comes with enmity, with hatred. Yeah. So be careful if you want to win, because the winner also produces a loser. And the loser may come back and want to win. So the Buddha recognizes that tension. And so with wisdom, we practice to let go of this kind of wrong action that goes about creating enmity for others. And we bring about right action. So we start with a view or insight. So we have a right view. And that right view means letting go of all of our views. So when we're holding on to a view, just like we learn with the skandhas, you hold on to certain perceptions, you grasp them as being really real, really true, then it's very difficult to actually see what's going on. Because you're using so much mental energy to hold on to things as you perceive them to be, you can no longer see them as they actually are. And so, right view comes from letting go of our concepts. And it comes with right thinking. So it means we think kind thoughts. Our thoughts always have a tone. They have some kind of quality or fragrance. And so throughout the day we may be chewing on something that's quite bitter, and it becomes very like sludge in our mouth. That's our thinking if we're not careful. It becomes kind of rotten. And so the practice of stopping, so nirodha, it means also to stop, right? So you cut off that source of suffering that's going through your discursive thinking, and just come back and practice to think kind thoughts. If you're feeling irritated, judgmental towards that person, just turn it around and say, think about something kind, something you admire in that person, something beautiful. And so that's how we turn wrong thinking into right thinking. So each part of the path type proposes that we also bring it into the second noble truth in terms of right and wrong, right? So wrong view, it means holding on to our perceptions, grasping on to our body, our feelings, our perceptions, our mental formations. Wrong thinking is thinking that has hatred, anger, jealousy, craving. Yeah. So not only craving, but also hatred and jealousy. So we don't have to be dogmatic about craving being the only source of suffering. Of course, we can see in jealousy there is craving. In hatred there is craving. And so perhaps to simplify things, the early compilers of the Buddha's teaching reduced it to one thing. But the type proposes we open it up and see the second noble truth also as an ignoble path, an entire path that we are living. And so we can look into ways in which we look at things, the way we think about things, the way we speak. So speech. And we progress on this path. So we have suffering, and the ignoble path. The causes and conditions which give rise to suffering. And then we have happiness. And the noble path, the path of happiness. Or if we like, we can say suffering, the path of suffering. And then happiness and the path of happiness. So we become aware of suffering. We see in what ways we are walking on the path of suffering that gives rise to that. And by doing so, we change our way and we see that there's happiness also. Looking into the suffering, we see the possibility of happiness. And we know how to walk on the path of happiness. Right view, right thinking, right speech, right action. So all of thinking, speech, and action, mind, speech, and body, the three kinds of action. We look to see what is at the root of that thinking, what is at the root of the speech, what is at the root of our action. And is there kindness there, or is there some kind of irritation or anger? And so if we see there's irritation or anger, then we practice stopping, so we don't continue to think those thoughts, we don't continue to say that speech, we don't continue to act based on that anger. And so meditation helps us to settle down so that we are calm. We sit and then our mind becomes lucid. In that feeling of irritation, we can see that it is impermanent. And we start to look into our life and we see how is it that we have been acting, doing things in the past maybe 20 minutes or the past half an hour that has brought about that irritation. I notice sometimes when I'm using the computer, I lose my awareness of my breathing, and my breathing can become quite shallow. I'm so focused on what I'm looking at in the computer, reading something or searching for something, and I notice that my breath has become shallow. And so then when I go away, I feel a little bit not so steady after using the computer. And so so I look into that and I say, okay, so maybe I should take care when I can just say, I shouldn't use the computer. But maybe I need to use the computer for my job or to help with something in the Sangha. So then I learn, how can I use the computer in such a way that I can follow my breathing and really be present for my body and also be present for what I'm searching for on the internet or whatever. So it's changing the approach. So rather than going on the path of suffering and just grasping at something online and forgetting entirely that I have a body, I can decide to come back to my body, come back to my breathing, and mindfully use the computer. I remember the first time I saw our teacher using a computer. I think I was a novice in Upper Hamlet. And Thai came into where we had the registration office before, and it was very interesting to watch Thai use the computer because I'd never seen it before, and I was very curious. How will Thai use a computer? Thai sits down very properly, upright, and then Thai would read the screen, and then maybe once every minute he would pick up his hand and put it on the mouse, and then click somewhere, and then he put his hand down back at his side, and he would read. And I thought, wow, I grew up in a different generation. We grew up with the mouse, and so we're always have our hand on it like this, moving it around, ready to manipulate the screen in front of us. But Thai would just only do it maybe once every minute or every couple of minutes, and then he would just be aware. I saw him being aware of his body, being aware of reading what's on the computer. And that helped me actually to change the way I practice mindfulness with my body and mindfulness of my breathing. Because I noticed that I had a habit of, because I grew up using a mouse and a computer, that when I brought attention to my breathing, I was trying to manipulate my breathing, just like the pointer on the screen of the computer. So I have my hand on the mouse and I'm moving, right, the pointer. Now you have a trackpad, right? So it's different, but it's the same principle, right? You're moving your hand, and then the pointer is moving on the screen. And so what you're looking at is changing according to what you're doing with your hand. And so in my first years of practicing mindful breathing, sometimes I struggled with that. I noticed that I wanted to control the length of my breath when I was mindful of it. And so I had to learn how to just breathe, like how to just breathe naturally. Of course, when I was not aware of my breath, I could breathe naturally. But if I really wanted to practice bringing all my attention to the breath, it took letting go of that habit of manipulating what I was observing to actually allow my breath to just come in and out naturally. So with time, that tendency to kind of manipulate the breath just started to fade away. And with that, the same thing happened with mindfulness of feelings. So I didn't, when I first started meditating about 20 years ago, I remember I just wanted the suffering to end. Whatever suffering that came up, I just thought, okay, I'll just sit here, and I sat in meditation, and I would have pain in my legs, and I would just want to control the emotions. And I thought, I had trust in Buddhism. If I do this right, I can just kind of like tear out my suffering by controlling with the control of my mind. And of course, that was not very successful, because the more I tried to remove my suffering, the more it just came back stronger. And that's because I didn't understand this simple teaching that Thai repeated over and over and over again, that there is no happiness without suffering. There are two words, they're describing what is part of, there's like two aspects of the same phenomenon. So this is why view is so important, because the way we look at something affects what we think it is. And so with meditation, we start to have a more three-dimensional view of our own mind, as well as of others and the world around us. And we see that what we take to be the entity or the real itness of something is only based on our perspective. And if we go around and we look on the other side, we see something quite different. And if we look from above, we'll see something different. We look underneath, we open it up inside. So we start to learn how to look at things from different perspectives. That's the teaching on right view. And that happens because we let go of our fixed perspective. We see something new, we think somebody tells us this is that, we learn that that is what this thing is, and then we fix in that view. And no matter what happens in our life, we just keep coming back to that same perception. So we meet them for the first time, they have some body odor, all we remember is that unpleasant body odor, and we have this negative perception of that person. And even though they might be one of our greatest teachers, or somebody that could be the kindest person we ever met in our life. But because we are caught in that fixed view about the person, we cannot see all the other wonderful aspects of that, of their being, of their qualities. So learning how language is based on dualistic concepts and learning to move beyond those dualism, to see the nature of things directly. So there's some, so happiness is one aspect, suffering is another aspect, but they're describing this, the same reality. That is the main point. We want to not break up reality into separate, discrete things, but actually see that when we look deeply, everything is related. And so the practice of using dualistic phrases like good, bad, even right, wrong. Yeah? We have the path of happiness, path of suffering, but actually the Four Noble Truths are describing, all talking about the same thing. They're not, the path of happiness is not separate, cut off from the path of suffering. If we understand wrong view, we understand right view. If we understand wrong thinking, we understand right thinking. If we understand right speech, and the same is true if we understand right speech, we understand wrong speech. Because they are not separate, they are just two aspects of the same reality. So the important thing is understanding the nature of action, or the nature of speech, or the nature of thinking, and how to bring about, how to say things that cause less harm. Everything. How to act in such a way that we cause less harm. And that is for our happiness and for the happiness of others. So right thinking, right speech, right action, right livelihood. So we are fair in our way of dealing with people, in our business, in our career. Yeah, we try to live by the golden rule. Do unto others as they would do to you. This is right livelihood. So in the Buddha's time, he saw that there are many ways that people are making a living that cause a lot of suffering, like suffering towards animals. If we kill animals for meat, we're often creating a lot of harm, a lot of suffering. If we produce weapons that are used in war so that men can kill more people, or women as well, yeah, that is a wrong livelihood. So when we talk about right, it means causing less harm, reducing the amount of suffering. And when we know, when we reduce the suffering, we bring about happiness. So that's why these are all related, the path of happiness. So we look in the way that we are making our livelihood. Today, because of our use of fossil fuels, we are harming the climate. We are changing the very nature of the planet that we live on. And that is, this is in our face every day, with wildfires, floods, melting ice caps in Greenland, and reduced ice cover in the Arctic, the slowing down of the Gulf Stream. Very serious changes are happening in the planet, and we don't know we can try to predict, and the predictions are not very beautiful. They don't show a planet in the future that we might have had growing up. And that means the next generations will not get this beautiful planet. They already, before they are born, have a great burden put on their shoulders. And that is because of wrong livelihood. We don't look at the ways in which we are stealing resources from the earth, that we are using, we are manipulating Earth's resources in a way that they are bringing our climate out of balance. And so that is a problem of looking superficially, just wanting to get the short profit, just for the moment. So I can be wealthy, I can be famous, but more famous than somebody else because I extract more resources from the earth. So this is a modern understanding of wrong livelihood. If we live in such a way that we are contributing to that, and we know that we are all contributing in some way, so that's why we learn how to cause less harm. So in the monastic community, we live together. Already by living together in community, we reduce the amount of time we have to, for example, use a car to go out to buy food. And we eat plant-based foods in the monastery. And we try to put our needs together. And so these are all ways that we are actively trying to practice having right livelihood. Living in such a way that we cause less harm, because we can no longer look the other way. We know that these, not paying attention to these externalities, these extra costs to our way of living are causing immense suffering. And so we need to, so the path is also ecological. It's an ecological way of living. Okay. And we already covered right diligence a few classes ago. So it means for those painful, difficult mental formations like anger, jealousy, fear, we know how to not water those seeds in our consciousness. So we know how to keep them down in the seed form so they don't manifest as a full mental formation in our consciousness. Everything needs nourishment, including our emotions. So if we know how to keep from nourishing our anger, then it doesn't manifest in our mind consciousness. And for those, the anger that's already manifested, we know how to invite it to go back down. And for those positive formations like mindfulness, concentration, or insight, like happiness, we know how to walk the path of happiness. We know how to touch those seeds so that they come up in our mind consciousness and stay for a long time. Is the fourth practice of right diligence. All those positive mental formations, we want them, invite them to come up and stay for a long time. So in the monastery we have gathas and poems that gathas means poems or verses that we say every day. Like waking up this morning, I smile. 24 brand new hours are before me. I vow to live each moment in mindfulness and look at all beings with eyes of compassion. So that waking up this morning, I smile, that's to generate joy. So that's the words are a skillful means to generate feelings of joy. And there are many verses or gathas like that we can practice throughout the day to nourish our gratitude and so forth. So that is inviting the positive seeds up and having them stay a long time. And so just like when we have right diligence, so for the path of suffering we have wrong diligence. It means that anger comes up and we just put more fuel on the flames. We just we see it's anger is there, and we just throw more gasoline on the fire. And the fire spreads out to other people, and before we know it, we have many, many angry people. So that is a wrong diligence. And when joy comes up, we just reject it. We push it away. What do I have to do with joy? I don't need to be joyful. We don't see the beauty of feeling a moment of joy, to be alive in this moment. It's like, wow, it's a miracle. So wrong diligence is the opposite, right, of right diligence. And then mindfulness and concentration. So right mindfulness is non-violent, like we're learning, holding our suffering with the light of mindfulness. We can use the image of holding. We can say shining the light of mindfulness. Wrong mindfulness, maybe learning how to be a sniper. You have to be very mindful of the target, right? So we can put our attention to things that cause harm and give a lot of awareness and attention to it. But because we don't see, as with right mindfulness, the whole picture, right? That we are training ourselves to kill, for example. We only look at it as obtaining an objective. So this is why when we talk about, in the Plum Village tradition, when we talk about the path of happiness, it's in the present moment. Thai called it, or the Buddha called it, Drishta Dhamma Sukha Vihara. Dwelling happily in the present moment. Drishta Dharma. So Dharma here means phenomena. And Drishta is literally it means the seen, what is seen. But here it has a sense of the present. Drishta Dharma, it means the phenomena that are seen. So it means what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, experience in the right here and right now, the phenomena that we experience. So Drishta Dharma, Sukha Vihara. So just like we have dukkha, we also have sukha. They are, it's more obvious in Sanskrit, they are opposites. Dukkha, sukha. Sukha is happiness, dukkha is suffering. And vihara means to dwell. So, Drishta Dharma Sukha Vihara, dwelling happily in the present moment. We don't have an object, we don't put our happiness out there somewhere. The sniper believes that he's killing someone who could harm the people of his country or his comrades, his fighting, his army, his soldiers. And so he believes that he's shooting that person to keep them from harming others. But that man over there is also trying to shoot them because he thinks he's harming. Yeah. So we have to be very careful right? If we need to be able to have this bodhisattva vision, which is a wider view of, and see that, man is not our enemy. Yeah, that happiness only has meaning if it is not an individual matter, right? Happiness as an individual is not true happiness. So the happiness of the sniper means it's connected with the happiness of his target. And so wrong mindfulness means we don't see the nature of dwelling happily in the present moment. Yeah. So we remove the subject and object. Another dualism, the foundation of all dualism. The subject, me, I, and you, the object, as two separate things. And with deeper meditation, we start to see that those are just constructs of our mind, that there's actually no subject and no object. They are only constructions. And by doing that, then right away we feel happy. We no longer feel the stress and the tension that comes with the idea of a subject and an object. The sniper shooting the target. And right concentration means we, similarly, concentration means we maintain over time our practice. Yeah, so right view with right concentration, it means every time we see our grasping onto some perception or some view, we let go. We continue to let go. We continue to let go. Yeah. So all of us can understand letting go of a view in one moment, but to continue to do that, to make it a habit, right? To do it over time, that's right concentration, right thinking, coming back to over and over again, bringing kind thoughts when we are angry, when we are jealous, coming back to thoughts of non-harming. That is right concentration. So concentration helps us to maintain our practice over time. So all of this is to kind of illustrate this declaration that is to help us to understand and go deeper into the Four Noble Truths. We can call the third noble truth the truth of happiness. So we don't misunderstand that it means the cessation of this body, these feelings, and so forth. But it means, when we talk about cessation, it means the cessation of suffering, which is happiness itself. And that is, and that there is a path of happiness. And by understanding the path of happiness, we see as well the ways in which we are walking on the path of suffering in every moment. And this is not something I really emphasize. Please don't put it out there as something very far away from you. Look at it in every moment. Like right now, I have something stuck in my eye, so I'm practicing the Four Noble Truths. I'm like, there's some kind of suffering. I have something in my eye, an eyelash, or I don't know what. And so I blink a little bit. I try to get it out. So I'm looking into, maybe I was not being very aware of my eye, not taking care of my body. And so there's a little bit of pain, a little bit of discomfort. And so in many ways, the Four Noble Truths are very much like the kind of Hippocratic oath that doctors take, right, in order to help heal the body. Right? So looking into the nature of the illness and then trying to find the cause of the illness. Right? That is the work of a doctor. So sometimes the Buddha was called Vaisajya Guru. It means the medicine teacher. He is, because he is not only healing our physical ailments, but also the ailment of our mind. Thank you for listening. And we will continue with the class with the 18th tenet, very exciting, on free will, next week.